Here we are. Welcome, everyone. And with us, we have Donald Rothberg, who I also spoke to last year. Donald is a longtime Buddhist teacher and writer and activist. Um, and so glad that you're here.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks, Alice, for organizing the whole series.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. Why don't you tell folks about your work, like what you do and how you came to it?
Yeah, it's been long term. You know, my uh, my ancestry is Jewish, but probably in my own family, that was very much interpreted in terms of social action, as was for many people of Jewish descent. All of my grandparents were immigrants who came from oppressive conditions. And I think all of my grandparents were actually socialists,
Mm, mm-hmm.
and they were active. And, my own upbringing was really to be definitely be more ethically grounded, socially minded. My parents marched some with Dr. King. They were, active. I came of age in the 1960s, so
Mm.
involved, aware of the civil rights movement, anti-Vietnam War work, the counterculture, all that stuff. So that was large, and yet I also saw what issues, particularly with the social change movements. And
Hmm.
I I studied also in and got to know what was happening in Europe. I studied for a summer in Paris. I actually had a grant from the US government to study French left-wing student radicalism.
Well,
Yeah, the government, and they didn't ask for a report. Okay.
they might not fund that right now, but I
Yeah,
get that.
it
That
might
happens.
be
Yeah.
different now. I might come under Doge scrutiny. We
Yes.
will see. But in any case, I was aware of also some of the limitations of some of the social change groups. At the time I asked questions like, how are some of the people treating each other? How are we with each other?
Hmm.
And there seemed to be sometimes missing a relational and inner dimension in terms of the social change movements. They had positions identifying what wasn't okay, oppression, war, violence, and so forth, racism. But my perception was that what people weren't always so kind or helpful or good with each other, and the organizations,
Hmm.
naturally enough, didn't always last that long
Yep.
for that reason. So that was kind of understanding that I was deeply committed to social change, but also saw some of the issues. And partly coming out of the 60s and early 70s, I also became aware of sort of inner work in various ways. Some of it was related to psychedelics and
Hmm.
having different understandings of my own being and the nature of things, and being more connected with the earth, doing a lot of hiking, and being in the mountains a lot,
Yeah.
and uh, and having friends who were starting to study Buddhist meditation. So I
Mm.
was very aware of that, and was also influenced by. I remember one friend. I was in my early 20s. He went to Harvard Graduate School in Buddhist studies, and I, visited and learned about what he was studying, and he told me about Nagarjuna, who was, like sometimes called the second Buddha, who
Okay.
was especially a teacher of emptiness. I started reading all that, which is kind of the most advanced Buddhist philosophy, even before I meditated. And so, long story short, I was at that time I went to graduate school, in philosophy and
Mm,
was reading a lot of social theory, but also reading a lot on spirituality and mysticism. And at a certain point, I started studying in the Insight tradition, met Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield and Sharon Salzberg and Jacqueline Schwartz, who were the main teachers at the time. And just instantly on my first retreat, I think it was a 2-week retreat, just connected very deeply and had experiences I had never had before. You know,
mm,
opening up particularly of what we sometimes call the subtle energy body. And so said, okay, I'm on this journey. But I knew over, from that experience that even though those teachers made it seem like if you really wanted to do what was the best with your life, you would just be a meditator all the time,
mm,
eventually be a monastic and do that all the time. And intuitively, I knew that my own vision was one of connecting deep inner work with deep outer response. And I
mm,
knew that very intuitively. This, we're talking about the late 1970s, right? And so, and that kind of vision, I also framed it at the time in terms of helping to develop forms of spirituality appropriate for our times.
mm.
Which, and I thought that really something appropriate for our times would be something that had a deep commitment to social dimensions and also deep inner work. And over the years, again, to condense a lot, actually several decades, over the years, that vision really was compelling for me and motivated me. It got expressed in different ways. At first, I took positions doing as an academic teacher, teaching in philosophy departments, and so initially I started doing a lot of writing about this intersection, actually more scholarly and academic writing about the intersection of spirituality and social change. Quite a bit of it was more interfaith. I
Mm.
had a background in other traditions as well as Buddhism. And one of my positions was at the University of Kentucky, for example. And when I was there, I would go out about I think every few weeks to the Abbey of Gethsemani, where Thomas Merton had been a monk,
Oh, wow.
um, south of Louisville, Kentucky, and got to know people there. Was in a group, and we met, and got to know a lot of Merton's unpublished writings, which was his journals and so forth, and very influenced by that. And over the years, also quite influenced by Jewish traditions and indigenous traditions, to some extent by Islamic, and of course, Buddhist and Hindu, Gandhi and so forth.
I
So,
just want to back up because I know some of who Thomas Merton was. He was a radical Catholic, right?
say what?
Thomas Merton, he was Catholic, right?
Yeah,
And
Catholic contemplative, and at one of the few contemplative monasteries at the time, uh, the Abbey of Gethsemani in Kentucky. Yeah,
yeah.
but he was also very involved in communication with people in social change movements.
Hmm.
So he had that kind of vision. He had been more of an activist when he was young, actually. You know, growing up, I think in New York State, if I remember right. And so um, I moved eventually to California, and I got a position to have my livelihood with a graduate school called Saybrook Graduate School, and eventually started a program there, an interfaith program called Socially Engaged Spirituality, which we did for 9 years,
Mm.
and actually visited the Abbey of Gethsemani on. We had retreats like it was a 2-year program. We had retreats, I think, 4 times. And one of our retreats, we met at the Abbey of Gethsemani. Another retreat, we met at one of the pueblos, met with shamans and so forth.
Well,
And so, but previous to that, I worked extensively in the 90s. I worked extensively with Buddhist Peace Fellowship and the International Network of Engaged Buddhism, and did a fair amount of writing on Buddhist-based, what we call socially engaged Buddhism. You know, along the way, I had studied with Thich Nhat Hanh
mm,
and met a lot of the Asian teachers involved with this, particularly Sulak Sivaraksa, who's not as well known,
yeah.
and did, scholarly writing on that, and also more general writing for the Buddhist Peace Fellowship Journal. And I also helped to start a program. Actually, the impetus for it came from Diana Winston. It was called the BASE program, or the Buddhist Alliance for Social Engagement.
Mm,
We developed 6-month programs. We did, I think, about 30 of them. And I was involved with several of them. They were typically 6-month programs for people combining social service or social change work. You know, variety of things. It wasn't all activism. It was people doing, educational policy or working with the homeless, or actually, people doing more activist work. And we integrated teachings and practices, and we developed a curriculum. And Diana and I wrote a manual together on that, and that a lot of that became the basis for one of my books called The Engaged Spiritual Life, which really was based on that work particularly. And so I've been especially involved in training programs for people connecting inner and outer, and later did a 2-year program at Spirit Rock, you know, called The Path of Engagement. Yeah,
so I'm curious.
yeah,
Like I'm hearing a story of authenticity, right? Like you have this background in social justice. You've had this really uh, this peak experience of discovering insight meditation, and you're like, we need outer, we need inner, we need to be treating each other better.
yeah,
And you've been integrating these for years and years and years, right? Since I
yeah,
was a very small child.
yeah,
And what if, like, what difference has it made? Like, it's two beautiful things, we should integrate them, is very compelling. And what have you seen possible from bringing these together?
yeah. Oh, let me say, initially, it sometimes led me to be lonely.
Yeah,
Yeah, we can go into that more, but
I can get that.
I mean, that's why actually, when I was first really deepening further in this, I was connected some with Spirit Rock, but my primary community was the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, and then the International Network of Engaged Buddhists based in Thailand, and
Mm,
especially. And I'd go there for gatherings, and connect with people. But I would say over the years, it really, I mean, partly it gives a vision of really having spirituality be expressed in all parts of one's life, and
mm,
not confined or restricted to the inner life. One of the problems with insight meditation, it's changed some, but one of the problems related to that quality of loneliness is that the emphasis in so much of Western Buddhism has been mostly on meditation,
mhm, mhm,
even though in the tradition and in the teachings of the Buddha, there are 3 main areas of training, broken down, as some of your listeners will know, in the Noble Eightfold Path, into training in wisdom, training in meditation, and training in what's usually translated as ethics. So 3
mm,
forms of practice. For different reasons, in most of Western Buddhism, the emphasis has been on meditation to the extent that even places like where I teach, Spirit Rock, is called Spirit Rock Meditation Center
Mm-hmm.
or the East Bay Meditation Center, even though there are these three areas of which meditation is one. And even though traditionally ethics was crucial, and I'll add one other point that connects with my vision. For the historical Buddha, the ethical dimension of training wasn't just understood in terms of individual face-to-face behavior. So
Mm.
sometimes people think, okay, there are these ethical guidelines not to kill or harm, not to steal, to be careful with sexuality and speech, and the way I frame it, substances with shift consciousness. And a lot of people could say, okay, I don't kill or steal, I'm good, ethics, check.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Right. But that's not the way the Buddha understood it. There was a social dimension. And for the Buddha, for example, to go back to a passage where he was teaching about the guideline on not killing, he said, do not kill, do not cause others to kill, do
Mm-hmm.
not approve of others killing. There's a social
Mm.
dimension there. You know, the
Mm-hmm.
well-known teacher Thich Nhat Hanh is very explicit about that. He says, do not kill, do not let others kill. Find all means to basically, if I remember right, end war. It has
Mm-hmm.
different ways of expressing it, but it's clearly social. So if my tax dollars are going for killing and harm, that's
Mm-hmm.
my ethical responsibility. According to Buddhist tradition,
Mm-hmm.
we actually have also, you have other aspects. There was a king named Ashoka, who was a Buddhist practitioner, lived about 2,400 years ago, ruled over much of India, Buddhist practitioner. He ended the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine a large country ending the death penalty, renounced war, had teams of people who were sent out to take care of the poor and the elderly,
Mm.
and applied this level of care also to non-human animals, and tried to have people reduce having non-human animals as food, including in the royal kitchen. So, and there are traditions of the Bodhisattva, and you can see this historically. There have been social interpretations of the ethical practice, but that's been marginalized in the West,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what I'm doing is partly giving back a vision for all the dimensions of practice, all the parts of our lives that has been somewhat lost and is still somewhat lost. And so I think, having clear grounding in ethical practice is one of the most important aspects of Buddhist practice that we can have now. And this is somewhat parallel. The Buddhist ethical guidelines are not so different than you find in other traditions, but the integration with meditation is different. So you can see that
Mm.
from one perspective, what I'm suggesting comes out of the tradition from 2,600 years ago. Bring together wisdom, meditation, and ethical training, and the ethical training involves the social dimension, not
Extending it to the
fundamentally
social.
different. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. I want to ask you something, and I don't know if it's too specific, but what
Okay.
do you think? There's this whole, I don't know if it's as big right now, but a year ago there was a lot of people calling out uh, spiritual practitioners who were not speaking about the genocide in Gaza.
Yeah.
Do you have any do you have thoughts on that? Like, I don't know if I have a more specific, like what you were just sharing about, we actually need to be thinking about the consequences of all our actions, or yeah,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
indirect.
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe just to start by saying the situation in what we sometimes call Israel Palestine or Palestine Israel has been very important for me for a long time, um, particularly since I was invited to teach in Israel in 2017 and 2019. And I had long trips there. It's my first time ever there. And I taught on socially engaged Buddhism there.
Mm,
I was invited to go and went 3 times to the West Bank, and met with Palestinians, different sort of contexts. One time was invited with a friend to go to an extended family's Ramadan gathering, and my
mm,
friend spoke Arabic. Other times going into communities and meeting people, who were doing work there, meeting Palestinians. So, and seeing up close a lot of mm, the issues. When I was first there, my first impression was this is like Mississippi in 1920,
I've
and
heard that.
my second thought was it's worse.
Mhm,
Yeah, because even on paper, the Palestinians don't have a lot of rights.
mhm,
And so, really hard situation. And I've tried in different ways to act, mostly small ways, but since then have been active with different groups. And last year, my good friend and really colleague, Rania Banks, who's a Buddhist teacher who's Palestinian American, we did a 3-part series on bringing Buddhist practice to Israel Palestine. That's still on the web. It was done for a retreat center called Southern Dharma,
mm,
and it's there. And we explored stuff. Um, and personally, um, my the people I have been most drawn to in addressing Israel Palestine have been the groups that bring together Israelis and Palestinians.
mhm,
Groups like Combatants for Peace, Families of the Bereaved, sometimes called Families Forum, standing together. Um, I think there's some other organizations and groups of people who are working collaboratively.
mhm,
So I have felt drawn to that. I have sometimes personally felt lonely with people who don't take that approach, finding the people who are working together, which is the vast majority of people who have spoken out. It tends to break down into people are basically um, calling out the harm being done,
mhm,
or on the one hand, or just affiliating with Israel on the other. And I've been drawn to holding both peoples with compassion and empathy, even
mhm,
if one is the oppressor.
mhm,
Yeah.
mhm,
And so that's for me lines up better with the socially engaged Buddhism. And so I've that being said, yeah, I would like to see some organizations come out publicly with that. Some have, but I would like to see that more. But that's the perspective that I find is connected with the Buddhist teachings are about universal compassion.
mm,
It's not just about compassion for some, even not even just about compassion for the oppressed. It's about compassion for everyone because one of the things that I saw when I was there on my first trip, and I came back and gave a talk in 2017. I said that both sides are to a large extent dominated by intergenerational trauma, which is not resolved. And
Mhm.
when one has trauma, you can't act in the present moment in a wise way, you know. And so I gave a talk on that, you know, when I came back, or one of the talks I gave. And of course, that's not to say that it's equivalent, or, you know, you're talking
Mhm.
obviously about a situation which one side has, you know, the political power and so forth, and the military power and so forth. So anyway, but those are some of my views on that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Uh, Very interesting. Probably more interesting than what I was actually asking.
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm actually I interviewed someone from Combatants for Peace yesterday, or the day before yesterday, one of the founders of Combatants for Peace. You were just mentioning.
It's called Tibetans for Peace.
No, Combatants for
Oh,
Peace.
Combatants for Peace. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, I think, you know, when they collaborate, you know, her the work, I was thinking also of the work when I was in one of my trips to the West Bank, I visited Bethlehem, you know,
Yeah,
and got to see I don't know if you've heard of the Holy Land Trust is in Bethlehem,
I think so,
and
yeah.
founded by the Awad family. So I find the work of Mubarak Awad, who was a leader in the first Intifada, which was mostly nonviolent, and he
Mhm,
was a nonviolent activist. And Israel, in its great wisdom, if I can be sarcastic, kicked him out.
mhm,
You know, and his nephew is Sami Awad, who I also find his work very, very powerful. And he, you know, his work based in Bethlehem is holding out the view of basically freedom, self-determination, um, well-being for everyone,
mhm,
not just our side, holding out for everyone, and also doing actually trauma work, and thirdly, organizing people.
mm.
You know, so I
Yep.
find him very aligned with the other groups I mentioned.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
my friends in Israel who were, you know, there's a group called Engage Dharma in Israel, and they're very aligned with this approach as well. I worked with them when I was in Israel, and I've done some work since October 2023 with groups in Israel. Yeah.
Um, so coming to our country, right? You and I are both in the US. How can we bring these principles of Buddhist practice, Buddhist wisdom, Buddhist ethics, or other spiritual practices, wisdom and ethics,
Yeah,
to yeah, to keeping the communities safe without and
in the
also
current
not doing
situation. Yeah, I
yeah.
think it's a time for great creativity. Also, I think
Mhm.
really, I haven't put so much effort into this, but very important, I think, for people from different spiritual traditions to come together in that vision of
Mhm.
socially engaged spirituality, bridging traditions. My effort has been to try to clarify how Buddhist practice in these three dimensions can be brought to the current time. And I actually I've done a fair amount of teaching on this. One of the teachings I did was outlining a contemporary eightfold path
Hmm.
for our times and bringing practice to our times. And I identified 8 different ways, which we probably don't have time for here, but 8 different ways to bring our practice to the current situation.
Hmm.
Um, um,
We can link to it.
yeah, you can link to it. It was a July 7th talk for Spirit Rock, and it was based in, it's on the website Dharma Seed, Dharma Seed. But to be brief, I think there were 3 ethical dimensions, 2 meditation dimensions, and 3 wisdom dimensions. And much of what I talked about in terms of the ethical dimensions, I've already covered.
Covered,
You
yep.
know, it's ground in the ethical guidelines, have a social vision of the ethical guidelines, ethical practice. See that your own practice involves a commitment to stopping harm from happening on so many levels, right? And so, and what that entails, that's another matter. But
Mm,
when it kind of leads to people saying, my practice requires that I go in this direction. Let's come together. And another dimension is really grounding in community
mm,
and finding the action that calls you.
mm,
Those are short way to
mhm,
talk about. In terms of meditation, I think I emphasized two. I could have done a lot more. I emphasized two, which is finding ways to work with, particularly with difficult emotions, and finding ways to air the difficult emotions. So many people I talk to have a lot of numbness
mhm,
in the current times. And when they can access emotions, there's anger, there's despair, a lot of challenging emotions. Buddhist practices of different kinds, mindfulness practice, working with the heart practices like loving kindness and compassion,
mhm,
including self compassion, can be really, really crucial. And I think teachers who deliberately go into this territory and bring up stuff, I think that's very crucial for our time. It can be even more powerful to do that kind of work in groups. And
mhm,
one of my teachers was Joanna Macy, who many of your listeners will know
mhm,
died a little over a month ago, July 19th. And she was a major teacher to me and a friend. We would have dinner together and so forth. And I got to know her first when I moved to Berkeley, and I helped start, it was 1988. And I moved from rural Ohio to Kentucky, and Kentucky to Berkeley, California. And she and I were helped start a community network of having daily meditation that alternated between our different homes. We had 10 households in
mm,
the community network. One of them was mine, one of them was hers. So we saw her every day for a long time. And then later I trained with her. But where I was going with this was she had a group method, really a kind of a group ritual called the Truth Mandala, which was, I think, collaboratively developed with people, if I remember right, in Germany.
mm.
And it's basically involves having a group. And we did this, in the training. We had the training right after the invasion of Iraq, the first
Oh, wow.
invasion of Iraq,
Yep.
1991,
No,
I think.
2001.
That was the
Oh,
second.
no, 1991. You're right. 1991. Yep, yep,
That was
yep.
the second. And we had 70 people. And what you do is you have a circle. You have people around the circle, and in the circle there are four quadrants: one for anger, one for sadness, one for confusion, one for fear. And there's a cushion in the middle for anything other than those. People go into the middle, they go to one of the quadrants and they speak out of their hearts. And often that ritual lets people access stuff that they never could access on their own or even
Mhm,
with meditation. I certainly did. I went into the circle, accessed my anger, my grief, and I connected with my anguish about the whole history of racism.
mm,
And and I had a sense, yes, we can deal with this. And that never would have happened. A lot of things happened. I was going in the circle for 10 minutes.
mm,
Things
mhm,
happened. So those kind of circles I think are really necessary now. It's really community sharing of what's there. So those are, and then the other meditation guideline I had, again, I could have had many, was stay in touch with joy.
mm,
Yeah. And I thought of a Hasidic uh, song that I knew about Rabbi Nachman of Breslau. I don't know if you've ever heard this. I don't know if it was from him, but he lived at the end of the 18th century in very oppressive conditions. And he had a song about him, I think, was Rabbi Nachman of Breslau used to say, friends, do not despair. A difficult time has come upon us. Our joy must fill the air. We must not lose our faith in living. We must not despair. A difficult time is upon us. Our joy must fill the air.
Mm.
Hmm. So I don't usually sing in interviews, but there you go.
Well, I brought it out of you. I understand.
Anyway, but so staying connected with joy in all sorts of ways while doing all the other things. So that was another guideline. And another one was staying in touch with vision, the vision of awakening. Another one was seeing the world through the wisdom lens. You know, and for me, this was seeing and being very able to identify greed, hatred, and delusion in the
Mm,
world, particularly at an institutional level.
mhm,
You know, and to see whatever, to see all this, see the harm being done. You know, we know what was it? The cuts to USAID already have led to the deaths of many hundred thousands of people, right? Can't, you know, and we're projected in the next 9 years to lead to, I think, 14 million deaths.
well,
That's what our policies are doing, right? To see through the lens of the teachings, to see, you know, my own, you know, I've taught a fair amount on Buddhist approaches to transforming racism. And when you know the history of racism, you see the bias and the antagonism doesn't come first. What comes first is greed for power and wealth. You can date that
mhm,
right back to Bacon's Rebellion, the late 17th century, but it's you see it in all the, you know, Reconstruction, the populist movement, the 30s, the 60s, the present time. It's all divide and conquer. And it's
mm.
all manipulation, basically preventing poor and working class whites and blacks getting together. That's what racism is about
In the US, yep, yep.
in the U.S. And so really seeing through the lens, it's about greed for power, and the same thing with obviously with the way the Congress works. You know, and I know that from also having worked in the U.S. Congress personally, you know,
Mm.
which was a hard experience. Yeah. Anyway,
Donald, we're definitely out of time.
okay.
Um, uh, so your free gift is basically a link to your website where there are a lot of free resources. Is that right?
Not so much to my website, but
Oh,
to the website Dharma Seed, where I have close to 900 talks and guided meditations freely offered.
okay. Very great. And we'll also put a link, we'll put a way for people to sign up to your email list. I guess it will
That
probably
can
be
happen.
separate.
And the July 7th talk on the Contemporary Eightfold Path for responding to the difficult times is one of those talks available.
Okay. Yeah, we'll see if we can make a direct link to it. Thank you so much, Donald. Great to be with you always.
Yeah,
And well, we'll be in touch over email, and folks can be in touch over email or internet.
great. Thank you. Thank you so much for your initiative and your work and for many years. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.